She shoved a crumpled envelope containing her life savings, exactly $14,500, across the dark mahogany bar. "Just pretend to be my husband for one weekend," Penelope begged the towering pale stranger. At 290 pounds, she was used to being the punchline, especially to her cruel ex-fiancé. She just needed a fake +1 to survive her sister's wedding. What she didn't know was that the man she was bribing was a centuries-old vampire king. And he didn't do fake. Penelope Higgins was a woman who took up space, and for the vast majority of her 28 years, society had made sure to penalize her for it. At 5'6" and 290 pounds, Penelope, or Penny to the few people who genuinely liked her, was the senior risk analyst at Gallagher Financial in downtown Boston. She was brilliant, fiercely loyal, and had spent her entire adult life trying to be invisible. But invisibility was no longer an option. The embossed, cream-colored invitation to her younger sister, Caroline's destination wedding, sat on Penny's cramped desk like a ticking time bomb. It wasn't just that Caroline was marrying into the wealthy old-money Astor family. It was the name printed neatly under the best man designation, Bradley Harrington. Bradley was Penny's ex-fiancé. He was also the man who 6 months prior had left her standing in the driveway of their shared apartment, telling her with a sigh of fabricated pity, "I'm sorry, Pen. I just need a woman who takes care of herself. I can't keep introducing you to my clients when you look like this." 3 weeks later, he was dating a Pilates instructor named Sienna. Now, Sienna and Bradley were going to be at the Oak Haven estate in Salem for the 3-day wedding extravaganza, and Penny was expected to attend alone, the tragic, fat, jilted older sister for everyone to pity. She couldn't do it. The mere thought of her mother Susan looking her up and down with that tight-lipped grimace, or Bradley's condescending smirks, made Penny physically nauseous. She needed a shield. She needed a husband. It was a torrential Tuesday night when desperation finally hijacked her common sense. After a grueling 14-hour shift, Penny found herself wandering down the narrow cobblestone alleys of the North End, soaked to the bone, her sensible flats ruined. She ducked into the first open door she saw to escape the freezing rain. The establishment, marked only by a heavy iron door and a discreet neon sign that read "The Nocturne," did not look like a typical Boston pub. The air inside was heavy with the scent of cloves, aged bourbon, and something metallic she couldn't quite place. Velvet drapes swallowed the sound of the storm outside. The patrons were impossibly beautiful, sitting in low-lit booths, speaking in hushed, melodic tones. Penny, dripping wet, her curly brown hair plastered to her cheeks, and her oversized beige trench coat clinging to her thick curves, felt like a gargoyle that had tumbled into a museum of fine art. She sat heavily at the empty bar. The bartender didn't approach her. Instead, the man sitting 2 stools away turned his head. He was, without exaggeration, the most terrifyingly gorgeous man Penny had ever seen. He possessed a sharp, aristocratic jawline, hair the color of midnight spilling over the collar of a bespoke charcoal suit, and eyes that were a piercing, luminescent silver. His skin was alabaster flawless and unnervingly pale. "You bring the scent of distress and wet wool into my establishment," the man murmured. His voice was a physical sensation, a low bass that vibrated against Penny's sternum. "I'm sorry," Penny muttered, shivering, suddenly exhausted by the weight of her own life. I needed to get out of the rain. I'll buy a drink, whatever's cheapest." "You look as though you need far more than a cheap drink, little bird," he said, shifting his body toward her. He didn't look at her with the familiar disgust or pity she was so accustomed to. He looked at her the way a starving predator might appraise a locked feast. "Tell me what troubles you." Maybe it was the exhaustion, or the rain, or the fact that she had hit rock bottom, but Penny broke. She told this stranger everything. She told him about Bradley's cruel departure, her mother's relentless comments about her weight, and the impending humiliation of the weekend. "I have the money," Penny found herself babbling, digging into her damp purse and pulling out the thick manila envelope she had withdrawn from the bank earlier that day. It was her emergency fund, her safety net. $14,500. I just need an escort, no an actor, someone handsome and successful to put a ring on my finger, walk into that estate, and pretend to be entirely obsessively in love with me, just to wipe the smirk off Bradley's face. I'll pay you. You look like you could play the part." The man stared at the damp envelope. A slow, dark smile curled the corners of his mouth, revealing a flash of something impossibly sharp beneath his lips. This was Lucius Montgomery. He was not an actor. He was the reigning sovereign of the Eastern Seaboard's vampire court, a creature who had lived for 400 years and amassed wealth that could buy the entire city of Boston twice over. He came to the Nocturne to observe his subjects, usually finding mortal affairs overwhelmingly tedious. But this mortal, she was different. Her pulse was a chaotic, thrumming symphony of anxiety and defiance. Her blood smelled like wild honeysuckle and copper so potent it made his fangs ache against his gums. And she was sitting here, this soft, rounded, trembling human, attempting to hire a monster to play house. 14,000. Lucius repeated the amusement dancing in his silver eyes. He reached out his long, ice-cold fingers, brushing against Penny's wrist. The shock of his temperature made her gasp, but she didn't pull away. "I'll sign a contract," Penny pleaded, her brown eyes wide, completely missing the danger radiating from him. "No kissing required, just look at me like I'm worth something." Something ancient and possessive flared in Lucius's chest. For centuries, mortals had begged him for immortality, for wealth, for the death of their enemies. Never had one begged him to restore her dignity. "Keep your paper, Penelope," Lucius said softly, his voice dropping to a hypnotic purr. He memorized her name from the bank slip peeking out of the envelope. "I will take your deal. I will be your husband for this gathering. But understand this, I do not deal in half measures. If I am to be yours, the world will believe it, and you will not flinch from the performance." Penny swallowed hard, mesmerized by his gaze. "I won't flinch." "Good," Lucius whispered, standing up to his full, intimidating height of 6'4". "Then, my lovely wife, we have a wedding to attend." The next 48 hours were a blur of supernatural efficiency disguised as extreme wealth. Lucius had instructed Penny to pack nothing. Instead, on Thursday morning, a sleek black Maybach idled outside her modest apartment building. The driver, a terrifyingly silent man named Thorne, who Penny assumed was just a very intense bodyguard, escorted her to a penthouse in the Back Bay. When Penny stepped out of the private elevator, she was greeted by an army of tailors, makeup artists, and jewelers. Lucius sat in a leather wing-back chair by the window, sipping a glass of thick, dark red wine. "What is all this?" Penny asked instinctively, crossing her arms over her stomach, suddenly hyper-aware of her faded leggings and oversized sweater. "Preparation," Lucius said simply, setting his glass down. He approached her, his movements utterly silent, like a shadow gliding across the floor. He stopped mere inches from her. "Your family and this Bradley have made you believe that your body is a flaw to be hidden. Today we dress you not to hide, but to conquer." "Lucius, I appreciate the gesture, but standard designer clothes don't fit me," Penny said, her cheeks burning with a familiar deep-seated shame. "I'm a size 22. I buy my dresses from specialty shops. These people," she gestured to the immaculately dressed tailors, "are going to look at me and tell me they have nothing." Lucius's eyes darkened, a terrifying stillness washing over his features. He turned his head slightly toward the head seamstress, a thin Frenchwoman. "Madame Dubois," Lucius said, his voice cold enough to snap steel. "Is there anything about my wife's magnificent form that you find lacking?" The seamstress actually paled, bowing her head quickly. "Nothing, my lord. She is a canvas fit for a queen. We have brought bolts of the finest silk and velvet. Everything will be draped to her exact measurements." My lord, Penny thought, blinking. She chalked it up to Lucius being an eccentric billionaire. The transformation was grueling but magical. They didn't try to squeeze her into shapewear that cut off her circulation. Instead, they celebrated her. They measured the curve of her hips, the fullness of her bust, the soft slope of her shoulders. By Friday afternoon, as they prepared to depart for the Oakhaven estate, Penny stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror and gasped. She was wearing a custom-made deep emerald green wrap dress that hugged every curve perfectly cinched at her waist with a subtle gold belt. The color made her skin glow, and her brown eyes looked like warm amber. Her thick hair was styled into luxurious cascading waves. But the pièce de résistance was the ring on her left hand. It was a staggering 5-carat blood ruby, surrounded by crushed black diamonds set in antique platinum. It felt incredibly heavy, both physically and emotionally. Bradley. Lucius stepped up behind her reflection. He was devastating in a three-piece charcoal suit, a silver pocket watch chain draped across his vest. He rested his large, pale hands on her bare shoulders. The contrast of his icy skin against her warmth sent a shiver down her spine. "You look," Lucius murmured, leaning down so his lips brushed the shell of her ear, "good enough to consume." Penny's breath hitched. She reminded herself this was a $14,000 performance, though he had refused to take the money yet. "Thank you. You clean up nicely yourself. Are you ready to face the wolves, Penelope? As long as you hold my hand," she whispered honestly. Lucius's grip on her shoulder tightened just a fraction. "I will do far more than hold your hand." The drive to Salem took just under an hour. The Oakhaven estate was a sprawling Gothic-style mansion surrounded by dense, ancient woods. As the Maybach crunched up the gravel driveway, Penny's anxiety flared. She could see the massive outdoor tents being set up for the rehearsal dinner. She recognized her mother's shrill voice echoing from the patio. Thorne opened the door. Lucius stepped out first, buttoning his suit jacket with an air of absolute authority. He turned and offered his hand to Penny. Taking a deep breath, Penny took it and stepped out. The moment they walked up the grand stone steps toward the patio, the chatter died. Penny's mother, Susan, a severe woman who had been a size 0 her entire life and never let Penny forget it, froze with a champagne flute halfway to her mouth. Caroline the bride dropped the seating chart she was holding, but Penny's eyes locked onto Bradley. He was standing by the outdoor bar wearing a smug tailored navy suit, his arm wrapped around Sienna's thin waist. When Bradley saw Penny, his jaw practically unhinged. He didn't just look surprised, he looked utterly dismantled. Penny walked with her head held high, the emerald silk flowing around her. Lucius's commanding presence radiating at her side like a dark sun. He didn't just walk beside her, he guided her, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. Penelope, Susan managed to choke out, hurrying forward. She looked from Penny to the towering, impossibly handsome man beside her, her eyes darting to the massive ruby ring catching the late afternoon sun. "What? Who is this? You didn't RSVP with a guest?" "Mother," Penny said, keeping her voice steady, "I'd like you to meet Lucius Montgomery, my husband." The silence that followed was so profound Penny could hear the wind rustling through the oak trees. "Husband," Caroline squeaked, rushing forward, her bridal veil fluttering. "Penny, what are you talking about? You're married when how?" Before Penny could formulate the lie they had rehearsed, Lucius took over. He stepped slightly in front of Penny, a subtle protective maneuver that made a strange warmth bloom in her chest. "We eloped," Lucius said, his voice a smooth, rich baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the patio. "In Europe? I simply couldn't wait a moment longer to make Penelope mine. I apologize for the breach in protocol, Susan, but I assure you we wouldn't miss Caroline's celebration for the world." Susan looked as though she had been struck by lightning. She forced a tight plastic smile. "Well, this is sudden. Mr. Montgomery, is it what line of work are you in?" "Acquisitions," Lucius replied smoothly, his silver eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. "I deal in ancient assets, real estate, private collections, things that require a long-term perspective." Bradley could take it no longer. He detached himself from Sienna and swaggered over, a forced, condescending laugh escaping his lips. "Penny married, come on. You expect us to believe that what did you hire him out of a catalogue?" Penny's heart hammered against her ribs, a spike of pure, terrified adrenaline. This was it. This was the moment she had dreaded. Lucius moved so fast Penny barely registered it. 1 second he was standing casually beside her, and the next he was directly in Bradley's personal space. The temperature on the patio seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air grew thick, heavy, with an unnatural pressure that made the mortals in the vicinity subtly rub their chests, suddenly struggling to breathe. "You must be Bradley," Lucius murmured, looking down at the other man, as if he were an insect that had crawled out of the drain. "Penelope has told me so much about you." Bradley puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his bravado, but Penny noticed a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Has she? Well, I hope she told you that I'm the one who suggested she get her life together. Though looking at her, she hasn't dropped a pound. Still eating your feelings, Pen." The words were a brutal, familiar knife to Penny's gut. She looked down, her face burning, wishing the stone patio would swallow her whole. A low, guttural sound, almost a growl, emanated from Lucius's chest. It was a sound that made every instinct in Bradley's mortal brain scream run. Lucius reached out and gently tilted Penny's chin up with two cold fingers, forcing her to look at him, not Bradley. "Why would I ever want my wife to diminish herself?" Lucius said, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silent patio. "Every curve, every inch of her is magnificent. She is a banquet in a world of scraps." He slowly turned his piercing gaze back to Bradley. "A man who cannot appreciate the bounty of a true goddess is merely a boy with a weak palate. Do not project your inadequacies onto my wife, Bradley. It is highly embarrassing for you." Bradley's face flushed a mottled, ugly purple. He opened his mouth to retort, but Lucius took a single, deliberate step forward. "Speak another word of disrespect toward her." Lucius whispered the words intended only for Bradley, though Penny heard them, "and I will tear your tongue from your throat and feed it to the stray dogs on this estate. Do we understand one another?" Bradley staggered back, literally tripping over his own feet. He looked terrified, gasping for air, as if Lucius had physically choked him. Without a word, he grabbed Sienna's arm and practically sprinted toward the other side of the lawn. Penny stared at Lucius, her chest heaving. You didn't have to go that far," she whispered. "He insulted what is mine," Lucius replied, simply, his eyes bleeding from silver to a dark, dangerous crimson for a fraction of a second before returning to normal. "I am a jealous man, Penelope." The rehearsal dinner commenced in a state of chaotic shock. The grand dining room of the estate was lit by hundreds of candles. Lucius was the center of attention. He was charming, wildly intelligent, and utterly devoted to Penny. He pulled out her chair, kissed her knuckles, and kept her wine glass full. Whenever Susan tried to make a passive-aggressive comment about the butter sauce on the lobster ravioli Penny was eating, Lucius would intercept it, complimenting Penny's appetite and staring Susan down until she withered into silence. For the first time in her life, Penny felt protected. She felt cherished. She knew it was a performance, an act bought with $14,000, but the safety he provided was intoxicating. But halfway through the main course, Penny noticed something strange. The head caterer, a tall, gaunt man with sallow skin, approached their table to pour more wine. As he leaned over Lucius, his eyes widened, locking onto the silver pocket watch chain on Lucius's vest, a chain that bore a very specific ancient crest. The caterer's hand shook sloshing red wine onto the white linen tablecloth. "Forgive me," the caterer rasped, his eyes fixed on Lucius with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. "I did not realize the king was gracing us with his presence tonight." Penny frowned, dabbing at the spilled wine with her napkin. "The king?" she asked, looking at the caterer. Lucius did not look at the man. He continued cutting his steak, his movements precise and calm, but his aura shifted, becoming heavy and suffocating again. "Leave us," Lucius commanded softly. The caterer bowed so low his nose nearly touched the floor, and he scurried backward into the kitchen shadows. Penny turned to Lucius, her heart pounding a strange warning rhythm. She looked at his pale skin, the unnatural chill of his touch, the way Bradley had folded under his mere presence, the crimson flash she thought she had imagined in his eyes earlier. "Lucius," Penny whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Who are you, really?" Lucius finally set down his knife and fork. He turned to her, his expression softening only for her, though the monstrous truth lurked just behind his beautiful face. "I told you, Penelope," he said, reaching out to trace the curve of her soft cheek. "I am your husband, and a husband protects what is his. The question is, how much of the dark are you willing to embrace?" The heavy oak-paneled doors of the estate's private library clicked shut, sealing Penelope and Lucius away from the clinking glasses and forced laughter of the rehearsal dinner. The room smelled of old paper lemon polish and dust. Moonlight poured through the towering bay windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the Persian rug. Penny stood by a massive globe, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach, suddenly feeling every ounce of her 290 pounds trembling. The emerald silk of her dress, which had felt like armor hours ago, now felt perilously thin. "Explain," Penny demanded. Her voice shook, but her mind honed by years. As a senior risk analyst at Gallagher Financial, was furiously cataloguing the anomalies. The freezing skin, the impossible speed, the way the caterer had bowed, the sheer suffocating terror Bradley had experienced from a mere look. "And please, Lucius, do not insult my intelligence. What did that man mean by the king?" Lucius did not move closer. He stood by the closed doors, his hands resting casually in his trouser pockets. In the dim light, his alabaster skin seemed to emit a faint, ethereal glow. "I promised you a performance, Penelope. I did not promise you lies, though I suspect the truth may be more than your pragmatic mind is prepared to digest. Try me," she challenged, lifting her chin. Lucius sighed, a sound like autumn leaves scraping against stone. "My full name is Lucius Valerius Montgomery. I was born in the year 1612 in a settlement that eventually became the city you know as Boston. I am the sovereign of the Eastern Seaboard Court. The men and women who rule the night, those who consume blood to survive, answer to me. I am a vampire, Penelope, and in my world I am absolute law." Penny stared at him. She waited for the punchline. She waited for the hidden cameras to emerge from the bookshelves, but the sheer gravity in his silver eyes anchored the impossible words to reality. She remembered the metallic scent in the nocturne, blood. She remembered the way he had touched her wrist, his temperature mimicking a corpse. "A vampire," Penny repeated the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. "I hired a vampire to be my fake husband for my sister's wedding." "You hired a king," Lucius corrected gently, taking a slow, measured step toward her. "And as I told you in my establishment, I do not deal in half measures. The human elite families like the Astors, whom your sister is marrying into, are well aware of our existence. They pay us tithes. They offer us discretion in exchange for wealth and influence. William Astor, the groom's father, owes his entire shipping empire to a deal his grandfather struck with my court in 1924. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced Penny's chest. "So everyone here, they know only the patriarchs. The caterer tonight was a ghoul, a servant of my court, checking on the Astor's loyalty. He did not expect to find his sovereign dining on lobster ravioli." A faint dark smile played on Lucius's lips. "You have unknowingly plunged yourself into the deep end of the ocean, little bird." Penny's legs gave out. She sank into a plush leather armchair, her head in her hands. "This is insane. I just wanted to survive the weekend without Bradley making me feel like a worthless fat joke. Now I'm sitting in a library with a 400-year-old apex predator." In the blink of an eye, Lucius was kneeling before her. The sudden movement made her gasp. He reached out his large, cold hands, gently grasping her wrists and pulling them away from her face. His silver eyes were ablaze with a fierce, possessive intensity. "Do not ever use that word to describe yourself in my presence," Lucius commanded, his voice a low, vibrating hum that commanded her full attention. "To a mortal fool like Bradley, perhaps you do not fit the starved, fragile aesthetic his weak ego requires. But to me, to a creature who has seen centuries of beauty fade into bone, you are vitality, you are abundance. Your blood sings with a sweetness that drives my kind to madness. You are a goddess of flesh and warmth, Penelope. And by the time this weekend concludes, every single person in this estate will know exactly what you are worth." Before Penny could process the heat flooding her cheeks, the library doors flew open. Bradley stumbled in a half-empty glass of scotch in his hand. His tie was loosened, and his face was flushed with liquid courage. "There you are, Pen," he slurred, squinting in the dim light. "Sienna's looking for the bathroom, and I wanted to talk to you." He froze when he saw Lucius kneeling in front of Penny. The vampire slowly rose to his feet, turning his back to Penny to face Bradley. The air in the library instantly grew thick and frigid. "We are having a private conversation, Bradley," Lucius said, his tone dangerously soft. "Yeah, well, she's my ex," Bradley spat, taking a step forward, emboldened by the alcohol. "And I know this is a setup. Penelope, come on. You don't have the kind of pull to land a guy like this. How much did you pay him from that little savings account of yours, the one we were supposed to use for our house?" Penny stood up, her fists clenched at her sides. "That money was mine, Bradley. You made sure to remind me of that when you walked out." Bradley sneered, looking her up and down. Look at you poured into that dress like a stuffed sausage. You think putting a diamond on your finger changes who you are? You're still just Penny, the girl who eats when she's sad, the girl nobody actually wants. Lucius didn't yell. He didn't raise his hand. He simply closed the distance between himself and Bradley with unnatural, terrifying grace. He grabbed Bradley by the throat, lifting the grown man 3 feet off the ground with a single hand. Bradley dropped his glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor, the scotch pooling like amber blood. Bradley clawed wildly at Lucius's wrist, his eyes bulging as his airway was completely crushed. "Lucius, stop!" Penny shrieked, rushing forward and grabbing the vampire's rigid arm. "You'll kill him, please." Lucius turned his head slightly. His eyes were no longer silver. They were a glowing, demonic crimson. Veins pulsed darkly under his pale skin. "He is a disease, Penelope. Let me cure the world of him." "No!" Penny pleaded, tears springing to her eyes, not for Bradley's sake, but because she didn't want blood on her hands. She didn't want to be the reason someone died, no matter how cruel they were. "He's not worth it. Please, Lucius, for me." At the words "for me," the crimson slowly receded from Lucius's eyes. The tension in his shoulders dropped. With a look of utter disgust, he tossed Bradley aside like a discarded toy. Bradley crashed into a mahogany side table, splintering the wood, gasping frantically for air as he scrambled backward like a crab. "Leave this room," Lucius whispered to the trembling man on the floor, "and if you ever approach my wife without my explicit permission again, I will not kill you. I will turn you, and I will bury you in an iron coffin beneath the Charles River to drown and revive for eternity." Bradley didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, whimpering, and bolted from the library, leaving a trail of ruined pride and spilled liquor behind him. Lucius turned back to Penny, producing a pristine white handkerchief from his breast pocket to wipe his hand. "He breathes because you willed it, Penelope. Remember the power you hold." The wedding day dawned with a heavy, overcast sky that seemed to reflect the storm brewing inside the Oakhaven estate. Caroline's ceremony was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon, followed by a lavish reception in the grand ballroom. Penny sat in her assigned guest suite, staring at her reflection in the gilded vanity mirror. The dress Madame Dubois had crafted for the wedding was a masterpiece of midnight blue velvet, featuring an off-the-shoulder neckline that highlighted her collarbones and a corset bodice that supported and celebrated her heavy curves. She looked regal. She looked powerful. She did not look like the old Penelope Higgins. Her mother Susan barged into the room without knocking, a cloud of expensive floral perfume following her. "Penelope, Caroline is having a meltdown because the florist used the wrong shade of white roses and oh." Susan stopped dead in her tracks, staring at her eldest daughter. For the first time in 28 years, Susan did not immediately offer a critique. She didn't suggest a shawl to cover Penny's arms or a girdle to flatten her stomach. She simply stared, her mouth slightly agape. "Well," Susan finally managed to say, her voice tight, "your husband certainly has deep pockets. Velvet for a summer wedding is a choice, but I suppose it distracts from the bulk." Before Penny could let the familiar sting of her mother's words pierce her newfound armor, the door clicked shut behind Susan. Lucius stood there, immaculately dressed in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that perfectly matched Penny's gown. "Susan," Lucius said, stepping into the room. The temperature dropped immediately. "It is customary to knock before entering the private chambers of a married couple." Susan flushed angrily. "This is my daughter's room, and it's my other daughter's wedding day. I don't have time for pleasantries." Lucius walked over to Penny, resting his hands on her bare shoulders, his cold touch sending a familiar grounding shock through her system. He met Susan's gaze through the mirror. "You will make time. You have spent decades diminishing the brightest light in your family, Susan. You have fed her insecurities to mask your own shallow existence. That ends today." "Excuse me," Susan gasped, clutching her pearls. "How dare you speak to me that way? You barely know us." "I know enough to recognize a parasite when I see one," Lucius replied smoothly. "Penelope will attend this wedding. She will smile for the photographs, but you will no longer offer your unsolicited opinions regarding her body, her life, or her marriage. If you fail to comply, I will purchase the mortgage on your home in Brookline and evict you before the end of the month. Susan turned pale, opening her mouth to argue, but the absolute chilling certainty in Lucius's eyes silenced her. She spun on her heel and practically fled the room. Penny leaned her head back against Lucius's chest, letting out a shaky breath. You really have a way with mothers-in-law. I have a way with pests, he corrected, pressing a shockingly tender kiss to the crown of her head. It is time, my queen. Let us go witness this mortal union. The ceremony was held in the estate's sprawling gardens. Caroline looked beautiful, and the groom, a handsome, blandly wealthy man named Harrison Astor, looked nervous. But as Penny and Lucius walked down the aisle to find their seats, whispers rippled through the gathered crowd of Boston elites. Heads turned, eyes widened. Penny walked with her head held high, the velvet heavy against her legs, the blood ruby ring catching the ambient light. She saw Bradley sitting 3 rows back, nursing a bruised neck hidden by a high collar, refusing to make eye contact. Sienna sat beside him looking miserable. When the vows were exchanged and the crowd moved to the ballroom for the reception, the true power dynamic of the room shifted entirely. William Astor, the patriarch of the family and the groom's father, was holding court by the champagne tower when he finally laid eyes on Lucius. The older man, a billionaire who commanded politicians and CEOs, went completely rigid. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure. Ignoring the crowd, William Astor rushed forward, practically shoving a waiter out of the way. When he reached Lucius and Penny, he didn't offer his hand. To the absolute shock of the surrounding guests, William Astor dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "My liege," William choked out, his voice trembling with a mixture of reverence and terror. I was not informed you would be gracing my son's wedding. I beg your forgiveness for any lack of preparation." The ballroom went dead silent. The string quartet faltered and stopped playing. Hundreds of eyes stared at the billionaire kneeling before Penelope's fake husband. Lucius looked down at William with mild boredom. "Rise, William. You are making a spectacle. I am here merely as the husband of Penelope Higgins, the sister of the bride. You will ensure her comfort." William scrambled to his feet, nodding frantically, his eyes darting to Penny with newfound terrified respect. "Of course, my lord. Anything the lady requires, anything at all." Penny's mother and sister watched from the head table, completely paralyzed by the sight. Bradley, standing near the bar, looked as though he were going to be sick. The realization of what he had thrown away and the unfathomable power of the man who had replaced him was visibly breaking him. Later that evening, under the guise of the crowded dance floor, Bradley made one final desperate attempt. He intercepted Penny near the terrace doors while Lucius was speaking with a pale, elegantly dressed woman who had arrived late. "Penny, wait!" Bradley hissed, grabbing her arm. His grip was tight, desperate. "Please, just listen to me." Penny ripped her arm out of his grasp, her brown eyes flashing with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. "Do not touch me, Bradley. You don't understand," he babbled, looking around frantically. "Sienna's broke. The startup I invested in is tanking. I have debts, Pen. Bad debts. I made a mistake. We were good together. You're stable. You have that savings account. We can go back to how it was. I'll even accept how you look now. I can look past the weight." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air. For months, Penelope had cried over this man. She had starved herself, hated her reflection, and internalized his cruelty as her own failure. Looking at him now, sweating, pathetic, and begging for her money while still trying to insult her, she felt nothing but profound pity. "You really are completely hollow, aren't you?" Penny said softly. Before Bradley could respond, a shadow fell over them. Lucius materialized beside Penny, his presence an absolute crushing weight. He didn't look at Bradley. He looked only at Penny. "Is this insect bothering you, my love?" Lucius asked. "No," Penny said, smiling up at the Vampire King. She slipped her hand into his cold one, feeling a surge of genuine affection for the monster who had restored her crown. "He was just leaving. Weren't you, Bradley?" Bradley backed away, his face pale, disappearing into the crowd without another word. Lucius pulled Penny close, wrapping his arm around her thick waist, pulling her flush against his solid chest. The music resumed, a slow, sweeping waltz. "You handled that magnificently," he murmured, guiding her onto the dance floor. "I had a good teacher," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "Though I suppose our contract is almost up. The weekend is ending. You gave me exactly what I paid for." Lucius stopped moving. Right in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by the mortal elite who secretly feared him. He looked down at her. His silver eyes were swirling with an ancient, terrifying devotion. "The $14,000 remains in your bank account, Penelope," Lucius said quietly, his voice vibrating through her. "I never accepted your money. Therefore, our contract was never bound by human commerce." Penny looked up confused. Then, what was it bound by? Lucius leaned down, his lips brushing against her neck, right over her thrumming pulse. His fangs grazed her skin, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt of pure electricity straight to her core. "It was bound by my desire," he whispered, his breath cold against her heated skin. "You begged me to act as your husband, Penelope. But a king does not act, he claims. You walked into my domain, you bared your soul, and you placed yourself in my care. You are mine now, and I intend to keep you." Penelope froze on the polished parquet floor of the Oakhaven ballroom, the sweeping strings of the orchestra suddenly sounding very distant, as though she was submerged underwater. The terrifying weight of Lucius's words, "I intend to keep you," reverberated through her skull. This was no longer a theatrical ruse designed to salvage her wounded pride. The towering ancient creature holding her in his arms had crossed the invisible boundary between performance and terrifying reality. "You cannot keep a person, Lucius," Penny whispered, her voice trembling, though she did not attempt to break his iron grip on her waist. "I am a senior risk analyst at Gallagher Financial. I have a lease in Somerville. I have a life. You cannot simply claim me like a piece of antique furniture." Lucius's silver eyes darkened with a possessive storm that made her breath hitch. He leaned back slightly, his thumb brushing over the soft, trembling curve of her lower lip. "A life?" he echoed softly, his tone dripping with an ancient, dangerous velvet. "You call, dodging the cruel remarks of a pathetic mother and weeping over a hollow boy like Bradley, a life, no Penelope. You were merely surviving. I am offering you an empire." The weekend concluded without further incident, though the atmosphere remained suffocatingly tense. The mortal guests gave Penny and Lucius a wide, terrified berth. By Sunday evening, Penny found herself back in the sleek interior of the black Maybach, driven not by Thorne, but by another terrifyingly silent man named Gideon. The vehicle sped back toward Boston, the city lights reflecting off the rain-slicked pavement. Lucius dropped her off at her modest apartment building, pressing a kiss to the back of her hand that felt more like a brand. He promised he would see her soon. Penny spent the night tossing and turning, convincing herself that by morning the supernatural nightmare would dissolve into the harsh, comforting light of her mundane reality. She was wrong. Monday morning arrived with a brutal, glaring sun. Penny, dressed in her standard corporate armor, a tailored charcoal gray blazer, and a matching skirt that accommodated her size 22 frame, and took the T to the Prudential Tower, where Gallagher Financial occupied the 42nd floor. She clutched her Starbucks venti drip coffee like a talisman, desperate for the familiar, boring routine of spreadsheets and market projections. However, the moment the elevator doors chimed open on her floor, the atmosphere was completely wrong. The usual chaotic hum of the trading floor was entirely subdued. Her direct supervisor, Mr. Henderson, a notoriously demanding man who typically barked orders without making eye contact, was standing by the reception desk. When he saw Penny, he visibly gulped, straightening his tie with shaking hands. "Penelope," Henderson squeaked, rushing forward. "Good morning. Please let me take your coat. We've moved your workspace." "Moved my workspace?" Penny asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Mr. Henderson, I have a massive portfolio review for the JP Morgan account due at noon. It has been reassigned to Jenkins," Henderson stammered, gesturing wildly down the hall. "Your new office is this way, the corner suite. The CEO vacated it this morning." Penny's heart plummeted into her stomach. "What did he do?" she muttered to herself, dropping her briefcase. She marched down the corridor, her sensible heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the corner suite, a room that overlooked the entire Boston skyline. Sitting behind the massive desk, looking utterly out of place in the corporate environment, was Lucius. He was wearing a dark, bespoke Tom Ford suit, casually turning a Mont Blanc pen between his long, icy fingers. "Lucius, what have you done?" Penny demanded, slamming the door shut behind her so her gawking co-workers couldn't hear. "You cannot buy my office." "I did not buy your office, little bird," Lucius said calmly, setting the pen down and standing up. He moved with that silent, predatory grace, closing the distance between them. I bought the entire building. Gallagher Financial now belongs to the Montgomery estate. I could not have my queen toiling away in a cramped cubicle under the direction of lesser men. I earned my position, Penny yelled, feeling the hot sting of tears in her eyes. It wasn't just anger. It was the suffocating realization of her own powerlessness against his immense, supernatural wealth. I worked 80-hour weeks. I built my career. You cannot just swoop in and overwrite my entire existence because you decided I am your new favorite pet. Lucius stopped. The cold, aristocratic mask he wore slipped, replaced by a flash of genuine, devastating vulnerability. He reached out his large hands, gently framing her face. "You are not a pet, Penelope," he said, his voice dropping to a low, desperate vibration. "You are my anchor. For 4 centuries, I have walked through a world that is completely devoid of warmth. Everything is transactional. Everything is cold. Then you walked into my establishment smelling of wet rain and heartbreak, and you offered me $14,000, your entire mortal safety net, just to be seen as worthy. You are the bravest creature I have ever encountered." He pulled her closer, the sheer mass of his hard, towering body pressing against her soft, heavy curves. "I do not wish to cage you. I wish to elevate you. You possess a brilliant mind. You understand risk finance and human nature. Govern my mortal assets. Take control of my portfolios. Rule by my side." Penny looked up into his luminescent silver eyes, her breath catching in her throat. She had spent her entire life trying to shrink, trying to apologize for the space she took up. But here was a king offering her an entire kingdom, demanding that she expand. "I won't be a token," Penny whispered, her voice shaking with raw emotion. "If I take your accounts, I run them my way, and I don't want you threatening anyone who looks at me wrong. I am a fat woman in a cruel world, Lucius. I have survived this long. I can handle myself." Lucius's gaze dropped to her mouth, an ancient ravenous hunger burning in his eyes. "I know you can, my queen, but you will never have to fight alone again." 3 months later, Penelope Higgins was no longer the timid risk analyst who hid behind oversized sweaters. She was officially the financial architect of the Montgomery estate, a vast network of real estate shell companies and ancient wealth that staggered the imagination. She moved her belongings from Somerville to Lucius's sprawling, fortified penthouse in Beacon Hill. Their relationship was a terrifying, intoxicating dance. Lucius worshipped her. He did not merely tolerate her size, he was utterly devoted to it. He commissioned garments from Dior and Givenchy tailored to her exact measurements. When they were alone, he traced the heavy curves of her hips and the softness of her stomach with a reverence that made Penny weep with a profound healing release. He had yet to drink from her, insisting that such a bond required her absolute uncoerced consent, but his physical devotion was absolute. However, the mortal world was one thing, the supernatural world was entirely another. December arrived, bringing biting winds and snow to Boston. It also brought the Winter Solstice Court Gathering, a mandatory event where the elite vampires of the eastern seaboard convened to pay respects to their sovereign. This year, the gathering was hosted at the legendary Fairmont Copley Plaza, which Lucius had completely bought out and secured for the night. Penny stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the penthouse, adjusting the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbones. She was wearing a breathtaking off-the-shoulder gown of crushed crimson velvet. She looked like blood and royalty incarnate. "You are nervous," Lucius noted, materializing behind her reflection. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I am human, Lucius," Penny replied, leaning into his cold embrace. "I am going to walk into a room filled with apex predators who view me as a walking juice box, and they know I am not one of them. They will view you as their sovereign queen," Lucius corrected, his eyes flashing crimson, "or they will cease to view anything at all." When they descended the grand staircase of the Fairmont Copley Plaza ballroom, the silence that fell over the room was absolute. Hundreds of immortals dressed in agonizingly sharp haute couture turned their unblinking eyes toward the staircase. The air was thick with the scent of predatory magic, expensive perfumes, and old blood. Penny kept her chin held high, gripping Lucius's arm. She felt their scrutinizing stares. She knew what they saw: a mortal woman, soft, heavy, and undeniably fragile in comparison to their immortal perfection. For the first hour, the court members bowed, offered their hollow pleasantries, and carefully avoided looking directly into Lucius's eyes. But immortal politics were ruthless, and weakness was always tested. The test came in the form of Lady Cassandra, a vampire who governed the Manhattan territory. Cassandra was terrifyingly beautiful, with bone-straight blonde hair and a figure so impossibly thin she looked like a porcelain doll. She approached the dais where Penny and Lucius were seated, holding a crystal goblet filled with deep crimson liquid. "My lord," Cassandra purred, sinking into a graceful curtsy. She then turned her piercing ice-blue eyes toward Penny. "And the mortal companion. We were all quite shocked to hear of your sudden domesticity, Lucius, though I suppose centuries of perfection can leave one craving excess." Cassandra's gaze swept pointedly over Penny's full figure. Several vampires in the surrounding crowd snickered softly. Lucius gripped the armrests of his throne, the marble cracking under his fingers. The temperature in the ballroom plummeted to freezing. He opened his mouth to speak, to likely sever Cassandra's head from her shoulders, but Penny placed a warm, steady hand over his cold one. She stood up. The heavy crimson velvet pooled around her feet. She did not look at Cassandra with fear. She looked at her with the calculating, merciless gaze of a senior risk analyst who had just found a critical error in a competitor's spreadsheet. "Lady Cassandra, is it?" Penny asked, her voice clear and ringing across the silent ballroom. "You oversee the Manhattan territory, specifically the real estate holding companies operating under Vanguard Equities, correct?" Cassandra blinked, her condescending smile faltering. "I do not discuss mortal commerce with cattle." "You should," Penny retorted, taking a step down from the dais, "because as of yesterday afternoon, I audited your accounts. You have been utilizing the Montgomery Estate's offshore shadow funds to cover up a massive deficit in your New York properties. You are bleeding capital, Cassandra. You are over-leveraged by nearly $400 million. Gasps erupted from the gathered vampires. Wealth was power in their world. To be financially ruined was to be entirely vulnerable. Cassandra's pale skin seemed to turn ashen. "You lie, you fat mortal bitch." Before the slur could fully leave Cassandra's lips, Lucius moved. It was not a walk, it was a violent teleportation. In a fraction of a second, Lucius had Cassandra pinned against a towering marble pillar by her throat. The crystal goblet shattered on the floor, spilling blood across the polished tiles. "My wife," Lucius roared, his voice a demonic thunder that shook the crystal chandeliers above, "just mercifully pointed out your treason. You steal from my coffers, you mismanage my territory, and you dare insult her form." Cassandra clawed at Lucius's hand, gagging her legs, kicking uselessly in the air. "Lucius," Penny called out, her voice calm and authoritative. The king froze, his fangs fully descended, his eyes entirely black. He looked back at Penny. "Drop her," Penny commanded softly. "She is broke, humiliated, and utterly irrelevant. We do not dirty our hands with bad investments." The entire court held its breath. No one commanded the sovereign. No one. Slowly, the demonic darkness receded from Lucius's eyes. He looked at Penny, and a terrifying, adoring smile spread across his face. He released Cassandra, letting the ruined vampire collapse to the floor in a heap of silk and shame. Lucius walked back up the steps of the dais, dropping to one knee before Penelope. He took her hand and pressed it to his forehead in front of his entire silent empire. "As my queen commands," Lucius declared. Penny looked out over the sea of immortals. They were no longer sneering. They were bowing. She had not needed to swing a sword or bear fangs. She had used her mind, her confidence, and the terrifying devotion of the monster at her feet to conquer them all. The weeks following the winter solstice court gathering cemented Penelope's absolute reign over the eastern seaboard's supernatural factions. No one dared question the mortal queen who wielded financial ruin like a bloody broadsword. Yet beneath the glittering surface of her newly conquered empire, a quiet, insidious shadow began to creep into Penny's mind. It was the undeniable fragility of her own human existence. While Lucius remained an unchanging alabaster monument to eternal power, Penny noticed the faint purple circles of exhaustion under her eyes after a long week of board meetings. She felt the chill of the Boston winter seeping into her bones. Her body, soft and beautifully heavy, was still tethered to the relentless ticking clock of mortal time. The disparity between them reached a boiling point on a rainy Tuesday in late April. Penny was sitting at the massive mahogany dining table in the Beacon Hill penthouse, reviewing a particularly complex acquisition of a rival pharmaceutical company when a sudden, sharp pain flared in her chest. It was a terrifying, suffocating pressure. She gasped, her hands flying to her throat, dropping her tablet onto the floor with a loud clatter. In an instant, the air in the room displaced with a violent whoosh. Lucius materialized beside her, his silver eyes wide with an unprecedented terror. He scooped her into his massive arms, his cold hands frantic as he assessed her pulse. "Penelope," Lucius commanded, his voice trembling, a sound so entirely foreign to the ancient king that it frightened her more than the pain. "Speak to me. What is happening?" She forced a shaky breath, the pressure slowly subsiding into a dull ache. "I am okay," she whispered, clutching his lapels. "It is just a panic attack. I have not slept in 3 days, Lucius. The Vanguard Equities audit was exhausting." Lucius did not look relieved. Instead, a profound, agonizing despair settled over his aristocratic features. He carried her to the velvet sofa, holding her against his chest, as if she might turn to dust at any moment. "This cannot continue," Lucius murmured, pressing his face into her thick, dark curls. "I watch you govern my world with the brilliance of a deity, yet you are trapped in a vessel that breaks under the weight of simple exhaustion. Every time you cough, every time your heart flutters, I am plunged into a hell I cannot endure." Penny pulled back, looking into his eyes. "We knew this, Lucius. I am human. I age. I get tired. I am not a creature of the night." Lucius gently cupped her face. "You could be. You know you could be. I have never forced the gift upon you because I wanted you to rule as you are. But I am begging you now, my queen. Let me make you eternal." The offer hung in the silent, dimly lit penthouse. Immortality. It was the prize humans had waged wars over, the dark secret guarded by the elite. Yet for Penny, the idea was terrifying. Her entire identity, her resilience was forged in the fires of her human struggles. To become a vampire meant abandoning the sunlight, the warmth of mortal food, the very essence of the life she had fought so fiercely to reclaim. But looking at Lucius, seeing the ancient, boundless love radiating from the monster who had healed her shattered soul, she realized that a life without him would be no life at all. Before she could answer, the penthouse security alarm shattered the quiet, a blaring, relentless siren that signaled a catastrophic breach. The weight of this choice was unimaginable. Since childhood, she had navigated a society designed to diminish her. Her body, with all its soft edges, had been a battleground of cruel words. Now she was being offered a reality where that very same body would become an indestructible monument. She would never age or wither, yet to accept immortality meant surrendering the human vulnerabilities that made her so uniquely resilient. Lucius was on his feet in a microsecond, shoving Penny behind the heavy oak desk. The heavy steel doors of the penthouse elevator groaned, then exploded, inward twisted metal raining across the polished hardwood floors. Stepping through the smoke and debris was not a rival vampire, but a ghost from Penny's miserable past. It was Bradley. But he was drastically changed. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and marred by dark, jagged veins. He moved with an unnatural, twitching speed. Flanking him were 3 massive rogue vampires, their fangs bared and dripping with saliva. Bradley had found the dark underbelly of the supernatural world, and he had sold his soul for a taste of revenge. "Hello, Pen," Bradley sneered, his voice a distorted, gravelly rasp. "I told you I was in debt. Turns out some of the people I owed were very interested in learning the security codes to the Montgomery estate, and they were more than happy to give me a little upgrade as a reward." Penny stared in horror. Bradley was not a full vampire. He was a ghoul, a poisoned hybrid driven mad by tainted blood. Lucius laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. It was the terrifying, hollow sound of an apex predator looking at dead meat. "You broke into my sanctuary," Lucius whispered, the temperature plummeting, "to steal from me, to threaten my wife. She was mine first." Bradley screamed, lunging forward with a stolen silver dagger aimed directly at Penny. Lucius moved faster than human comprehension. He intercepted Bradley mid-air. The sound of breaking bone echoed sickeningly through the penthouse. Lucius grabbed Bradley's arm, snapping it backward so violently the silver dagger clattered to the floor. The three rogue vampires charged, but Lucius was an ancient sovereign. He met the first rogue, driving his hand straight through the creature's chest and ripping out its black, corrupted heart. The second rogue turned to flee, but Lucius caught him by the spine, crushing it with a single brutal twist. Bradley crawled backward, screaming in agony, his bravado entirely shattered. "Please," he begged, spitting black blood. "Penny, tell him to stop. You spared me before." Penny stepped out from behind the desk. She looked at the pathetic, ruined man who had once made her feel so profoundly worthless. She remembered the nights she had cried over his cruel words about her weight, the way he had discarded her for not fitting his shallow, pathetic mold. Now, he was begging at the feet of the fat woman he had despised. Penny looked at Lucius, her brown eyes completely hardened. "Do what you must, my king," Penny commanded coldly. "He is bad debt, and we cancel bad debts." With a swift, merciless motion, Lucius ended Bradley's miserable existence, tossing the broken ghoul aside, as if he weighed nothing. The remaining rogue vampire surrendered, dropping to its knees, whimpering for mercy. Lucius summoned his guards, who swiftly dragged the surviving traitor and the corpses out of the penthouse, leaving behind only the lingering scent of smoke and a profound, heavy silence. Penny stood amid the wreckage of her beautiful home, staring at the spot where Bradley had perished. She felt no remorse, no sadness. The last chain linking her to her agonizing human past had been utterly severed. She was completely free, yet the reality of her fragile mortality had never been more violently apparent. Lucius approached her slowly, his hands stained with the dark blood of his enemies. He looked down at his own brutalized state, shame briefly flashing in his luminescent silver eyes. He feared his monstrous nature would finally drive her away. But Penny did not recoil. She reached out, taking his bloodied hands in her soft, warm ones. She pressed them against her chest, right over her wildly beating heart. The rhythm was fast, a chaotic drumbeat of survival and adrenaline. "I am not afraid of you, Lucius," Penny whispered, her voice steady and resolute. "I am only afraid of leaving you alone in this dark world when my time runs out." Lucius dropped to his knees amid the ruined marble and glass. He buried his face in the soft green velvet of her gown, wrapping his powerful arms around her thick waist. He held onto her as if she were the only tether keeping him from spinning into an endless void. "Then stay," he pleaded, his voice cracking with an ancient, devastating sorrow. "Stay with me, Penelope. Rule this empire by my side. Let me drink your pain, and I will give you the stars. I will worship every curve, every thought, every breath you take until the oceans dry and the sun burns out. Do not leave me to the centuries." Penny looked down at the fearsome vampire king kneeling at her feet. She thought of the $14,000 she had shoved across the bar, begging for a mere weekend of pretend dignity. In return, she had been given a kingdom, an unwavering protector, and a love so profound it defied the laws of nature. She threaded her fingers through his dark hair, gently tilting his head back until his silver eyes met hers. "I accept," Penelope said, a brilliant, tearful smile breaking across her face. "Turn me, Lucius. Make me your queen forever." A fierce, triumphant joy erupted in Lucius's chest. He rose, lifting her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her toward their shadowed chambers to begin eternity. The transformation was not a brutal attack, but a sacred communion. In the quiet darkness of their bedroom, surrounded by the scent of fragrant jasmine, Lucius gently pierced the skin of her neck. The bite was a rush of pure golden euphoria. As her human heart slowed its frantic rhythm, slipping away into the quiet abyss, a new magnificent power surged through her veins. When Penelope Montgomery finally opened her eyes, they no longer held the anxious brown hue of a frightened mortal girl. They burned with a magnificent luminescent crimson. She was fat, she was beautiful, and she was immortal. Together, the king and his true queen stepped out onto the balcony, ready to rule the endless night. Did Penelope make the ultimate sacrifice to reign as a dark queen, or did she remain tethered to her fragile human existence? What would you have chosen if an ancient billionaire vampire king offered you the world just to be by his side? Drop your thoughts down in the comments below. We love reading your theories and reactions to Penelope and her dramatic journey. If this thrilling tale of romance, revenge, and supernatural justice kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Do not forget to share and subscribe to our channel for more stories.